In this video, you'll learn the strengths and weaknesses of 3 of the most widely used design apps on the planet: Photoshop, Illustrator, and Procreate. Plus, you'll see how they can all work together in tandem. Before we get started, do me a favor, and pretty please, subscribe to our channel and hit the thumbs up at the end if this video is helpful. Thank you. The first big difference between these 3 apps is the type of artwork each is best at creating. Now, broadly speaking, there are 2 kinds of artwork in the digital realm: raster and vector. So let's start with raster. Here we are in Photoshop looking at a raster image of a bunny rabbit. He's very cute, right? Now, what does raster mean? Raster means that this image is made up of individual pixels, and we can see that if we start zooming in. Eventually, the pixels become apparent, and the whole thing turns into a blobby mess. We lose detail. There's not more detail that we can gain or see by zooming in closer to this. And that, in a nutshell, is the way raster images work. And there are some advantages to raster images, namely, most photographs are going to show up in a raster image format. That's typically, just how the technology works. The disadvantage is if we need to scale this bunny up really large, let's say to put on a giant billboard on the highway or something, we're going to lose detail, and when you scale it up, it's going to start looking like this. But you can manage that when you're creating artwork in Photoshop by thinking ahead to how much resolution you're actually going to need. But this is the first important thing to know about the difference between Photoshop and Illustrator. Next up, you've got vector artwork, which is a different beast entirely. And speaking of beast, here is a beast inside of Adobe Illustrator. This is another bunny rabbit, obviously, but this bunny is not a raster image. This is a vector image. And what does that mean? Well, as I pointed out, in Photoshop, a raster image is going to prevent you from scaling in and maintaining detail. However, a vector image lets you scale as large as you would like to, and you'll see that these edges, even on these little details, remain really, really smooth, all right? That is the advantage of vector. Now, how does that work? Well, if I just switch to my mouse tool and I start hovering over pieces of the bunny, you'll see that this bunny is just made up of shapes. And you can still have details like gradients and really kind of organic looking shapes that are imperfect and create them using the vector tools inside of Illustrator. And essentially what's happening is there's a mathematical representation of that shape, which means that as I zoom in, that shape can be scaled up with perfect fidelity. And this is really, really useful in a lot of cases. And so as we move through this video, you're going to see some of the use cases for raster versus vector artwork. But in a nutshell, this is one of the major differences between Photoshop and Illustrator: raster versus vector. Photoshop and Illustrator are optimized for the type of artwork that each is best suited to create, though they can both work with either format. Procreate, on the other hand, is currently raster only. Now, given that Procreate is really built around doing illustration and creating realistic brush strokes and textures, this makes sense. Each app has its own strengths, so let's go through them and talk a bit about when you might want to use one over the other. If you're creating artwork that's going to be used at multiple resolutions and may one day actually be used on a really large format thing like a poster or a billboard or a giant screen, it's very helpful to create that artwork in Illustrator because then, as we said, it will be vector and you'll be able to scale it up. This is very, very common when you're doing logo design. So here's the School of Motion logo, several of the lockups we use, and as you'll notice, if I zoom into our triangle mark here, I can zoom in essentially forever, and I will never lose detail on those because these are vector-based images. And going back to this bunny example, you can see that vector artwork can be very, very detailed. It doesn't have to be sort of simple shapes and things like that. It can have shading, and it can look very organic and even look hand-drawn if you spend the time to make it look that way. The tools inside of Illustrator are optimized to make it easy to create complex shapes. Because it's a vector tool, a lot of the tools built into Illustrator are built around this concept of using shapes to create the artwork. And so as an example of how useful this can be, if I create a circle and then I just make a few copies of it like this. Let's make one down here. Let's make another copy kind of off to the side here. And I want to try to get it sort of centered like that. And then maybe one more over here. What I can then do is select all of these shapes and use the Shape Builder tool, which is right over here in the menu. The shape builder tool is going to let me select overlapping parts of these shapes to create new shapes. So for example, I could select this interesting shape here, and I could select this shape here. I could hold Option and get rid of shapes that I don't want, right? And I can start to build these things up and create shapes that would actually be pretty difficult to do by hand. And then once I have these, I can manipulate them even further. I can fill them with different colors. So this is a simple example, but just sort of showing you how Illustrator is optimized more for building shapes versus creating things that look photographic. When you get into animating your designs in After Effects, the difference between raster and vector becomes even more apparent. So here I have the vector bunny and I have the raster bunny inside of After Effects in the same comp. And if I grab them and I adjust the scale to make them larger, you'll see that both of them currently are starting to get that pixely look, even the vector artwork. Now, you would expect it from the raster image of the bunny, but you're probably not expecting that from the vector bunny. And all we need to do to fix that is to click one little switch over here in the After Effects interface. Next to my vector layer, there's a little checkbox here that's currently unchecked. And if I click that, that turns on continuous rasterization, meaning that it takes the vector artwork and it will continuously pull the detail out of it and make it crisp no matter how big you scale that sucker up. And so you can't do that with the raster bunny because this image is made up of pixels and there's not more information to be had by scaling it up. So inside of After Effects and when you're animating things, you can really see the usefulness of things like this. And so how might this be useful in real life? Well, let me turn off the vector bunny for 1 second and scale the raster bunny back down. If I'm working on an animation, there might be parts of the animation where I want the bunny sort of, this size in the frame, but then maybe later on, I want to have a close-up of the bunny's face. And the problem is that close-up is going to look like booty. You can see that it's just really pixelated. However, if we use the vector bunny, right, we can scale it down and use it at any size we want. It could be really, really small. And then we could actually zoom in and fill the frame with the bunny's face if we wanted to. And it's still going to be very, very, very crisp. It will never, get pixelated and lose that resolution. And so this is a much more useful asset in terms of animation. You can still do this with raster images. You just have to make sure that they are very high resolution. Illustrator is also a great tool even when you are designing in Photoshop. So what I'm going to do is select this bunny and I'm just going to hit Command-C and copy this, right? Now, I could paste it inside of Illustrator and have two bunnies, the old cliche about multiplying like rabbits. However, I'm going to go into Photoshop. Inside Photoshop, I can hit Command-V to paste the vector bunny, and you'll see it's asking me how would I like to paste that bunny. I'm going to paste it as a smart object and hit OK. I'm then going to hit Return. And now the bunny is in our scene. And what's cool about this being a smart object copied over from Illustrator is that it maintains the vector nature of this artwork. If you look over in our layer browser, you'll see the bunny here and it has the name Vector Smart Object. I can just rename that bunny. And now if I hit Command-T to transform the bunny layer, I can scale it up. And unlike the raster bunny layer, it will maintain its detail and it will continuously rasterize at a higher and higher resolution as I scale it up, the same way it works in After Effects. And another great thing about working this way is I can come over to my layer browser and double click on the smart layer. What that did was open up Adobe Illustrator and open up a copy of this bunny, a new fresh copy of it that it's labeled vectorsmartobject.ai. But what's really neat about this is I can now change this bunny. So as an example, I'm just gonna grab one of the bunny's ears like this, and I'm gonna go over to my layer browser and figure out which layers are making up the ear, and it looks like it's these four right here. So I'm just gonna select all of those and I'm gonna cut them and repaste them separately, right? And then I'll just make sure that they're in the correct order. So then what I can do is I can, rotate and move and stick this thing over here like this, right? Like he's listening to something. Cute little guy. If I hit save and then go back into Photoshop, you can see that this bunny has now been updated automatically. This is a really, really handy way of working between the two apps. And one last cool thing I want to point out about Illustrator is that you can use what are called artboards inside of it. An artboard is essentially a separate canvas, and you can have many of them inside of one Illustrator file. This is really, really handy if you are doing storyboards for an animation project. This example here was created by a friend of School of Motion's, B. Grandinetti, and this is a set of storyboards for an animation she produced for us. And what's awesome about it is that you can see how easy it would be to copy an artboard and then create a different version of it, for example, in the scene where the flashlight turns on. And because it's vector, I can zoom in as close as I want to any of this artwork, and I can sort of play with different framings. If we wanted to make a wide shot and then that transitions to a close-up, that's very easy to do. And you can also then zoom out and see all of your storyboards in one view, which is really helpful to judge continuity and color palettes and see how things are working together. So now let's talk about Photoshop. The name Photoshop should tell you something about the type of imagery that this app is really optimized for. Here's an image of our creative director, Ryan Summers. And just to show you an example of the type of thing that Photoshop is really known for, I'm going to change the color of this jacket he's wearing, which I don't think he would appreciate because I'm sure he color coordinated it. In Photoshop, you have a tool called an adjustment layer. You can find them down here with this little button, and I'm gonna add a hue and saturation adjustment layer. This is just a layer that acts as an effect over every layer that's underneath it. So I can click on this adjustment layer and then come up here to the properties panel and adjust the controls for it. Now, I don't want to adjust the color of the entire image, only a certain part of it, right? And so what I'm gonna do is instead of working on the master hue of this image, I'm only going to work on the reds. And you'll see that there's a little color selection made here. And so now if I adjust the hue, it's adjusting his jacket, but for example, not the shirt here. Now it's also adjusting his skin, which is not a good look for anybody. So let's just pick an interesting color. Let's turn his jacket green. Now I don't want his face to be green, right? And so I could try to mess with this selection here to exclude his skin tones from this adjustment layer, but there's a much easier way too. Because Photoshop is raster based, it's really easy to just paint masks and things like that directly onto your image. It's a lot faster and more accurate. And so you can see over here on my adjustment layer, I've got this icon telling me that it's a hue and saturation adjustment layer. And then I've got over here this white tile, which is actually a black and white mask telling Photoshop where this adjustment layer should actually show up. So everywhere there's a white pixel here, it will show up and it will change the color. But if there are black pixels, it won't. So here's what I can do. I can push B to switch to my brush tool. I can come over here to my brush settings and make sure that I'm using just a soft round brush, and I can turn the size of that brush up quite a bit. That's great. I'm gonna set my color to black, and then I'm just gonna paint right on this image. And I do need to be careful because it'd be very easy to sort of overpaint and actually exclude part of the jacket that I do want to change color. But you can see how quick and easy this can be. And it's even easier if I'm using a tool like a Wacom pen, a Wacom stylus, or even a Cintiq, because then I can be a little bit more accurate. Right now, I'm using my mouse, which is a little bit of an exercise in masochism to do this kind of thing. However, you can see that it works just fine, and as long as you're careful, you can really quickly do precise masking just like that. And Photoshop also has a lot of effects built into it that are really useful on raster-based images to get some cool looks. So just as an example, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to combine these two layers so that they're kind of merged into one thing that I can put an effect on. Then I'm going to go up to the filter menu, and you can see there's a whole bunch of effects here. What I would like to do is a fake tilt shift blur effect. A tilt shift blur is just a very, very shallow depth of field. It tends to make things look small, and it can be used for interesting effects. And so I'm going to move the focal point up to Ryan's face like this. Then I'm going to rotate the blur effect so that it's more aligned with his body. And then I'm going to crank the blur amount up a little bit so we can really see this effect. And then I can kind of pull the controls out to kind of blend this effect a little bit so that it's a little bit more subtle on the edges. And then I'll just hit OK. And there we go. So you can see how easy it is to do things like manipulate very specific colors, paint out areas of the image that you don't want to be affected, and then apply these really cool image-based effects to get neat looks for your artwork. Because Photoshop is raster based, the artwork creation tools inside of it are a little bit more optimized to get really organic, sort of soft looking textures and things like that. So here's a good example. I can open up the brushes palette here and see a whole bunch of brushes that I've got loaded into Photoshop, including some designed by Kyle Webster, who actually sold all of his brush packs to Adobe and has been making new ones that are free for every Adobe user. And so let's grab a brush that has kind of a soft edge, like this watercolor dragger. So you can see that the shape of this brush is really, really interesting. And if I start painting with it, you can see how it builds up in this really interesting, organic way that would be really almost impossible to get if you were using a vector-based tool. Because again, remember, vectors are all about the mathematical descriptions of the shapes that you're making. And when you have things like this that need to overlap and layer and build up over time, it's just much, much, much harder to do that with vector tools than with raster tools. And so Photoshop has lots and lots of tools like this that can give you really, really, and I hate to use the cliche term organic, but it can give you very organic looking brushes, textures, things like that, which for a lot of artwork styles is appropriate. You've already seen how easy it is to move artwork from Illustrator over into Photoshop and to maintain the vector-like nature of that artwork while you're designing, so that's great. I also want to show you how Photoshop works with After Effects because the integration between the two is really, really useful. All I've done is added some googly eyes to Ryan Summers here, and you can see that I have separate layers for the pupils and the white part of the eye, and I've saved this as a Photoshop file. And now after importing that Photoshop file into After Effects, I have access to all of the layers that were in that Photoshop file, and now I can animate them however I want. By the way, if you're new to this and you'd like to learn more about how to prepare Photoshop files and then import them into After Effects, we have a couple of great tutorials for this on our YouTube channel, links in the description. So the very cool thing about this is that now I've set this up in Photoshop and it looks exactly the way I want, but then inside of After Effects, I can move these layers around and animate them however I want to. And even things like this hue and saturation adjustment layer that we used to turn Ryan's jacket green, I can actually change that even once I'm inside of After Effects. I could even animate that if I wanted to. So there's a lot of really cool sort of crosstalk between these two apps. They work very well together. The last thing I wanted to tell you about Photoshop, and it's beyond the scope of this tutorial, but you should be aware of it, is that Photoshop has animation tools built into it. And so if you get into the world of animation, you may find that you want to start doing some things that are done a little more traditionally, frame by frame animation. You can do it inside of Photoshop. This is just a very simple example. I've just set up a 12 frame animation where there's sort of a very crappy ball bounce, and you can even play this thing back. You can render it out and bring the result into After Effects and manipulate it even further, but it's just something that I want on your radar. So as you get further into the world of animation, you're aware that Photoshop is not just a tool for doing still designs. Real quick, if you want to learn how to use Photoshop and Illustrator from one of the best teachers on the planet, check out Photoshop and Illustrator Unleashed from School of Motion. You'll learn how to use most of the common features in both apps, and you'll learn how they're used to create artwork that can eventually be animated. It's part of the core curriculum at School of Motion and one of the best investments you can make in your career. And if you're just starting out, check out our free 10-day course, The Path to MoGraph. You'll get to see a project from start to finish, from initial design all the way to final animation. You'll also learn about the types of careers available to designers and animators in the modern creative world. Check it out. The link is in the description. All right, moving on to Procreate. Procreate is an iPad app, so that's one big difference, and it is raster-based like Photoshop. But really, the biggest thing about it is that it's designed for illustration, and that is what it's optimized for. Because it's tablet-based, that means you can use gestures like two-finger zooms and pinches to zoom in and out. You can rotate your image to get a better angle while you're drawing, and you can use an Apple Pencil, which gives you pressure sensitivity and makes it much easier to actually draw. Because Procreate is raster-based and it's designed for illustration and creating things that really look like they were drawn, it makes it a lot easier to get really natural-looking textures. For example, in the brushes menu, you'll see that Procreate comes with a lot of brushes that look really organic and natural. Let's look at the paint section and grab something interesting, maybe this stucco brush. And then we can pick a color that we like, and then we just start drawing. Now you can see how organic and realistic the texture of this brush looks. That's because of Procreate's brush engine, which is amazing and is really optimized to do things like this. The way brushes blend and work together is also very natural. It can get you some really cool results. You can even do things like smudge the pixels that you've laid down already. And there are many, many different types of brushes, drawing tools. There's things that look more like ink, like pens. There's a lot of artistic options here, and you can play with all of them and kind of just go wild. That's kind of the fun thing about using Procreate. And Procreate, like Photoshop, has a layer system. So if I click on this button, you'll see I have a lot of different layers and different types of layers that make up this image of the sandwich. And I can turn those on and off. I can actually change the blending modes. There's a lot of similarities between Procreate's layer system and Photoshop's. In fact, the two work so well together, I can actually save this Procreate file out as a Photoshop file. If I select that file we were just working on, I can then share it. And in the share options, you'll see there is an option for Photoshop file. Once it's exported, it'll ask me, where would you like to send that Photoshop file? And I like to use AirDrop, which is a great feature that you can use if you have an iPad and a Mac computer on the same Wi-Fi network or within Bluetooth range. And that Photoshop file is now available for me to use on my desktop. And now, having opened that Photoshop file on my desktop, I can see all of the layers that I created in Procreate. This is super handy because now, for example, if I decide that I don't like the color of the egg yolk or something like that, I can just sort of scroll down until I find that layer, which is right here. And then I can use any of the tools in Photoshop, like hue and saturation, to adjust it to my liking. And then, of course, I can import that Photoshop file into After Effects, and I have total control over all of the layers, so I could animate this thing if I wanted to. And there's an even slicker way to use Procreate with Photoshop. Let's say I'm looking for something really organic and hand-drawn looking, but I want to use it in Photoshop. What I can then do is go over to the Tools menu, click Copy, and now back in Photoshop, I just hit Paste. And look at that, it comes right over, and whatever resolution my Procreate project is set to, that's the resolution that it comes through in Photoshop. And then what I could do is use any of Photoshop's tools to treat this, change it, make it fit better with my design. I could rename this layer something like Squiggle. I could then control-click it to turn it into a smart object so that I can scale it up and down. I could move it in the layer stack so I could put it in between layers if I wanted to. And then I can use any of the tools in Photoshop to manipulate it. So if I wanted to give it a different color, let's say I want to, I don't know, play off of the background, but then maybe have it be a little bit brighter, I can fill a layer right above that, use that layer as a clipping mask, and now I have total control over the color of this. And then from there, if I wanted to, I could duplicate this, offset it, use it as a texture, copy and paste something else in. It's a really, really handy way of working between the two apps. Procreate also has some rudimentary animation tools and a new 3D paint function. The developers of Procreate are adding new features all the time, and I expect it will just continue to get more and more powerful. Most projects, especially if you're working in the world of animation, will require using more than one app. I thought it might be helpful to look at an example in which you'd use all three apps together, eventually bringing the results into After Effects for animation. I'm starting off in Illustrator for this Mario-inspired design. You could probably see why. I'm building bricks and blocks, and I'm going to be building this green pipe, and all of these assets are made out of really simple shapes that just sort of layer up and combine to create the artwork. Illustrator is really ideal for doing things like this, and it makes it very easy to build up complex shapes. Then I bring all those elements into Photoshop and I start laying out the scene there. I find that that's just a better way for me to work. And what's cool about Photoshop is I can combine the vector artwork that I created in Illustrator with photographs. And I'm using a photograph of sort of a dirt ground texture, a photograph of my good friend E.J. Hasenfratz, some clouds, a shrub, and I'm manipulating them and pixelating them using some of the effects in Photoshop. I'm also adding some shading, a vignette, which is something I overdo constantly, and just trying to get the scene to look the way I want. I wanted the Goomba, you know, the little bad guy, I wanted him in the scene too, but I wanted him to look more hand-drawn, and so Procreate is the perfect tool to do that, and it was really pretty easy to draw the Goomba in that app. So then I copy and paste the Goomba into Photoshop, lay it out, bring the whole thing into After Effects. And in After Effects, everything comes through exactly the way I set it up in Photoshop. And I can do some really simple animation, a little 2-frame walk cycle for the Goomba, animate the clouds a little bit, animate EJ coming out of the pipe, and voila. From start to finish, this entire scene probably only took me, 45 minutes to create and animate. And that's the power of using these 3 apps together. You can really use them each for their strengths. So there you go. I hope you now have a much better understanding of how these 3 design programs can be used both on their own and together to play to their strengths. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel so that we can teach you even more design and animation tips. Head to schoolofmotion.com to learn about our interactive online curriculum and leave a comment if you have any questions. See you next time.